In last week's episode, we talked about telekinesis as an allegory for the use of technology. Let's see what you had to say. Okay, let's talk about Professor X. Great conversation in the comments, pinned it to the top. Professor X, not a telekinetic, just a telepath. There's a difference. I realize there's a difference. I think that it is not so cut and dry, but I will say that it was hasty to say that in everything Professor X has been in, he has been a telekinetic, because that is true that is not clearly the case. What I will say is this: I think that there are no shortage of situations, many of them outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is another sort of misstep, where the strength, let's call it, of Professor X's telepathy means that its effects verge on something that is telekinetic-like, and that is the sort of thing that plays into the kinds of stuff we're trying to talk about in the episode, including the kind of thing that happens in Logan. But more than anything, I think that this is an interesting conversation about the line between certain powers and how certain writers have control over the sort of latent abilities that a lot of characters have, and whether or not it could be said that they still have them, or it is still the case, even if they are not deployed in a really explicit way. But yeah, Professor X has just ended up causing a much larger conversation than we thought it would, and yeah, it was interesting. Jib Jith and Solstice Hanan mention an angle that we didn't get to in the video, which is the economic one. That maybe the reason that there are telekinetics is because the effects are now cheap and easy to do, and the rendering quality is good enough that you can make something that's remotely believable, as evidenced maybe by the fact that we had things in the episode itself flying around, controlled by, someone's mind. And I think that this is a good take, and I think that it is absolutely a factor, but I question whether or not that is the reason, like the inspiration. Like, do we feel, assuming that we agree that there is a feeling of these characters, like we're drawn to these characters, do we feel drawn to them at this moment particularly because they're easy to make, or their abilities are easy to visualize? I don't necessarily think that's the case, but it certainly maybe feeds back into the system of, like, well, we feel drawn to them, and if we feel drawn to them and we want to include them in visual media, well then, oh good, it's easy to make it look good, and if it's easy to make it look good, then people are going to think it's cool, which means they're going to feel even more drawn to it. So yeah, it's part and parcel. Thompson PR42 brings up another aspect of telekinetics losing control, and that is not when they sort of have to control themselves or fight with themselves to maintain or manage their powers, but when they are weaponized, and uses StarCraft as an example of that aspect of this archetype. And I wonder, like how this scans onto the allegory that we proposed using technology. And like, is this something like the danger of someone who is a particularly gifted technology user being conscripted into let's say less than altruistic systems, and I think that you can take your pick. Is that Silicon Valley? Is that cyber warfare? Which is maybe a little bit more one-to-one with StarCraft. But yeah, I think this is a really interesting way to think about this. Earthenfist writes a really interesting comment that counters the idea that the telekinetic is maybe an allegory about technology, by saying that it might be an allegory about just the use of things in general. And the way that they set this up is really interesting. It's sort of about how if someone is able to have an expert level understanding of just things in general, objects, that for whatever reason then gives them the ability to control them with their mind, then we sort of get to the classic fear of the unnatural or the new, or the unexpected, that this would be just a relationship that someone has with things in general, or the universe. So maybe we're sort of back to that globular thing idea, that then, would give you pause and would give you reason to be fearful of them losing control, because we're not necessarily talking about just their own, this is, if I'm picking up what you're putting down, we're not necessarily talking just about their own control, but about how they are able to essentially use matter at hand. And I think that's it's a really interesting way to look at it. Thanks for this comment. Wrengg makes the really good point that in a lot of depictions of telekinetics, their telekinesis is medicalized or is often related to a larger mental or physical health situation. You have 11 from Stranger Things wearing the hospital gown, being the subject of an experiment, Legion being in the mental hospital, and having sort of to work with mental health professionals, and Professor X being in a wheelchair, and other related things. And I think that this is a really good point. And my read on this has always been that if you have someone who is both telekinetic and is of perfect health, then they would be OP. They would be basically too powerful. And I think that if you compare it to, this holds some water if you look at telekinetic villains, who often are telekinetic and of good health. And then they are very, very powerful and scary and terrifying, and nothing can stop them. And so, there's this balancing act that happens when they're protagonists, that they have to have some sort of fatal flaw to make up for the fact that their central ability is one that, if it was not balanced out, would make them unstoppable. But I do agree that it does have a place in the allegory as well, which is that basically if telekinesis is an allegory for the use of technology or the use of things, however you want to, whatever sort of size, whatever sort of scope you want to give it. And part and parcel with that is what happens when we lose control, when we are able to take actions and we can't control our actions and have unintended consequences. Then there needs to be there needs to sort of be like an inbuilt reason for that loss of control. And so I think in a lot of ways, insofar as the telekinetic allegory is one where someone has lost control, the medicalization or the sort of the health-related aspect is the driving force behind what that loss of control, what the source of it is. But yeah, I think that is another huge aspect of this, which is how someone's health, the depiction of a telekinetic's health, factors into how these characters are portrayed. Ninja Boy, thank you for running the numbers. Ninja Boy checked to find out whether or not demon names start with letters at the end of the alphabet and found that, in fact, demon names tend to start with letters at the beginning of the alphabet. But I want to say that I'm not necessarily concerned with demon names that begin, like what letters they begin with, but just kind of the general makeup of them and whether or not they more often than not have letters from the end of the alphabet in them in comparison to, say, other kinds of fictional names. Because when I think about it, I don't know a ton of demons off the top of my head, but when I think about your Azraels, your Beelzebubs, the devil, Mephistopheles, hold on, I have one or two. Yeah, Baphomet, Astaroth, Abraxas. There's usually some letter combinations in there. Uncommon, end of the alphabet. Just saying. It seems like a thing. It seems like those are the scary letters. Even if the names don't start with a scary letter. We can't all be Zools and Pazuzus. Just saying, in Azrael, that Z is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Not Worth My Time writes a really interesting comment about the anonymity that is potentially inherent in telekinesis, and I think this is great. This makes a lot of sense and I think directly relates to our idea about it being an allegory for technology really perfectly. That there is a way for you to use this kind of power and remain behind a veil, so to speak, and to have an effect without announcing directly or clearly that you are the one that is the cause. So yeah, spot on. Love it.